Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our afternoon session. My name is Joe Schmidt. I'm the Social Studies Specialist for the Maine Department of Education. Today, I am happy to announce we are starting number 1 in a Maine history series of at least 3, potentially more. I know we've got the first 3 bucketed out and ready to go. And I'm happy to have our host today, David Cheever, who for 12 years, if I was correct, was the lead or the head of the Maine State Archives and is currently the vice chair of the Maine Bicentennial Commission. And I was lucky enough to get to work with Dave in a couple different capacities. And I reached out to him in talking about Maine history. And he started telling one wonderful story after another. I said, okay, that's exactly what I need you to do, because I will give you a room full of people that will love those stories. So we picked out some of the favorite stories. We kind of grouped them in a little bit of a chronological order. But from this point forward, I will turn it over to David Cheever to go ahead and tell us all about Maine history.
Well, I'm not going to tell all about it. We've got to keep some things hidden. Joe, thank you, and thank everybody for jumping on. This is an opportunity to do something with teachers that up to now I've been pretty much only doing with classes. We began looking at how to present the bicentennial in kind of a dress rehearsal beginning in 2011 when we were doing the sesquicentennial of the Civil War. And what we developed was a core story about Maine and the Civil War and the impact of Maine upon the Civil War and the impact of the Civil War upon Maine. We're going to touch some of that on the way through, but the whole idea was this was, in fact, the precursor to doing something on the bicentennial. And the point was that for me to go into classrooms and deal with anything from, I was as young as 4th grade and into the college level, and then dealing with adult organizations throughout coastal Maine, is it was easier for me and easier for them to deal with things that were local, things that they knew about, that they could say, oh, okay. And the fact is that the Maine State Archives has the distinction of having the most comprehensive set of records of the Civil War of any state, north or south. And the odd thing there is Maine in the Civil War was half the size, half the population that it is today. And in telling the stories and making them local, that seemed to work in the classroom, because in every instance, there was not a single class, and this is over 90 presentations, that we didn't have somebody in the class who had a relative who had served and had returned, or a relative who had served and who died in the war. There were families dealing down through the generations. In one case, there were people who left the class, went across the street to the grocery store, and brought the owner back to say, this is your great-grandfather. So those things kept happening. And I thought, well, the bicentennial may turn out to be the same. Now, we're not the only thing, obviously. The State Archives has voluminous records on the Civil War, but obviously because it's the archives, voluminous records of all kinds that can be researched, particularly now that we're going more and more online. And the State Library hosts Digital Maine. Those of you who can go on can find any number of things that can intrigue you, but with the idea of making it local, bringing it to the immediacy of your classroom. As I said, it worked for me. The State Archives, State Museum is going to have some nice stuff. Obviously, many of you know about the Maine Historical Society, not just the society itself, but they've spent a lot of time and money on the Maine Memory Network. Our website for the bicentennial, maine200.org, has a number of things that you will find interesting that you can grab pretty easily, and you can adapt them as you wish for whatever you want. And we also have been working with Masthead Maine, and as they've been trying to figure out how to cover the bicentennial, not just in newsprint, but obviously digitally. Behind me are a few of the books that have proven to be tremendously valuable. And I can say that all of you will have a chance to pick up a copy of Maine Becomes a State by Ron Banks. That book was out of print, and the Cultural Affairs Council agencies have agreed to take some of the proceeds from the sale of the Maine Bicentennial license plate and republish Maine becomes a state. And when you read into that, you will find a wealth of material that can detail what happened, how it happened, and when it happened, so that it takes on a life of its own. I've also had a lot of fun with Neil Roll, the late Neil Roll's book, Maine, A Narrative History, where he sort of meanders and finds things that are of interest to him, brings them out in somewhat of a chronological order. But you can find tremendous anecdotal stuff in there, and Neil did a good job researching it. I have yet to find anything that I could prove to be incorrect. Another one we had fun with, and if you get a chance to talk to Micah Pauling up at Orono, his Wabanaki Homeland in the new state of Maine, that's the Joseph Treat Journal that I'll touch on in one of the other presentations. In fact, I may do that here, but the key to that is this was the Joseph Neptune and Joseph Treat and John Neptune's trip up the Penobscot and down to St. John, and their report back to Maine's first governor on what that land looked like, and I'll explain why that trip was necessary. State Museum 2 years ago came out with the story of Maine and 112 objects. If you don't have a copy of that in your school, or you don't have your own copy, I'd suggest picking that up, because that has a wealth of information, and obviously it's built on the artifacts of the Maine State Museum. Another one, if you don't have it, this is a Tilbury House publication, Stover's Eminent Mainers, hundreds, if not thousands, of small biographies of people who have done interesting things, and we wouldn't necessarily know about them because they're not featured in a generic history book. But what they are featured in are these areas of science, commerce, the military, education, and the fact is they all had hometowns. They were all Mainers, and finding these people out, doing a little bit of extra work on them, that's been a lot of fun for us. On a weightier compendium, Maine, the Pine Tree State from prehistory to the present, former museum employee Ed Churchill was one of the prime organizers of that. And if you go back a little further about the centennial, the history of the state of Maine by William Williamson is pretty good. Want you to note in this one, the jump in population in Maine from 1790, just about the end of the Revolutionary War, 1800 to 1810 to 1820. This is extraordinary growth, extraordinary, and it has a cause. It wasn't that everybody in France or Germany or England or Ireland or Scotland was discovering Maine. A lot of this was immigration from Massachusetts. Massachusetts had trouble paying its war debt from the Revolutionary War, and they also had a small problem that I'll get into in just a minute, where some of the people who were in charge didn't like some of the people who were already there, and were encouraging them to find their idea of freedom, their idea of growth by going to the province of Maine. It was then the District of Maine, and the more people who came here, the more there became an agitation for Maine to become its own state. And as you can see, when you can go in 20 years about double your population, you are going to have a wider range of viewpoints about what's going on. One of the people who plugged into this early on was William King. He was born in the Portland area, I think Scarborough, Westbrook. His father died at a young age. His half-brother Rufus, I cite him a little bit further on too, goes and becomes a pretty big person in New York. He is educated in the Ivy League schools. William King is not. He leaves Westbrook barefoot with a couple of mules or oxen, and he kind of finds his way to Topsom. He becomes, through dint of his own natural abilities, he becomes a businessman. He runs a lumber yard, a real estate developer, becomes a state senator as a Democrat Republican. During the War of 1812, he becomes a major general. He had been in the militia that was technically Massachusetts militia, and that militia connection is going to resonate down through history, not just for William King, but right on through to the Civil War. And part of his responsibility was preparing Maine's coastal defenses, and that enabled him to meet and become strong acquaintances, if not friends, with a lot of the people who were most interested in protecting and promoting Maine. About this time, 1794, and we have Bowdoin College being established and becoming fairly well established in Brunswick. It was chartered in 1794, and in 1804, William King becomes one of its overseers. Now, the overseers had a pretty important role. One of their important roles was they reported back to the legislature in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts about all the wonders of Bowdoin College, and they would solicit from the Commonwealth money and in some cases land. Now, in this case, the Bowdoin College overseers were all Congregationalists, and that religious denomination comes to have a big role in how Maine becomes a state, because many of the people who were coming in the 1810s into 1820 were not Congregationalists. We had a strong Congregationalist population, but we started to see different denominations. The Catholics were still not terribly welcome, and the Hindu, the Buddhist, we weren't seeing any of that. There was some Jewish population, but not to the point that they had the numbers that you were seeing for the Congregationalists. Well, William King was on the board. His sister married Benjamin Jones Porter, who was also a doctor and served as the board's treasurer. Jesse Appleton was the Bowdoin president at the time, and Benjamin Orr was on the board. He was attorney. Now, William King figured out that Bowdoin was not really doing what it should do for the population it was attempting to serve. And he argued that there ought to be greater acceptance of students from another denomination than Congregationalists. He thought this District of Maine should have a second college, and you know what? Maybe the District of Maine should become the state of Maine. You can imagine how well that went over with the overseers at Bowdoin College. They began to suspect what William King was up to, and they came to find out. Well, one of the things they did is Benjamin Porter, as treasurer, pledged a sizable amount of his fortune to Bowdoin College. They were all expected to divvy into helping the college along. And Porter, the way he made his money outside of any medical profession was he owned 3 mills on the Androscoggin River. Well, just to be on the safe side, he asked William to sign on as a guarantor of the pledge to Bowdoin College. And while King agitates for the second college in Maine, as you can see, the Bowdoin president and other trustees were displeased. Well, 1813, 1814, there's flooding on the Androscoggin River. And that flooding washes downriver from Turner, Benjamin Porter's 3 mills. And with it, Benjamin Porter lost a sizable amount of money. He defaults on his bond to Bowdoin College. Or, with the president's support, turns around and they sue William King for payment. They attach liens to every piece of property William King owns. It takes him 4 years to pay off the debt. Now, this is about the same as what we've seen, I think, in national politics recently. How do you suppose William King felt about Bowdoin College sticking it to him? Never mind whether he should have signed on for his brother-in-law, and never mind whether, a natural disaster, maybe Bowdoin should overlook it. But if you can recall, in 2011, the Washington Correspondents' Dinner, where Barack Obama took Donald Trump and made him a subject of ridicule, the same thing happened here. They were trying to suppress William King's interest in statehood, and they really were trying to suppress his interest in helping start a second college in Maine. Well, take a look here. Look at what happens with a couple of denominations, particularly the Baptist population, as it goes from under 2,000 in 1800 to just over 9,000 20 years later. The Methodists had no registered voter, no member of the census who could report that in 1787 he was a Methodist. But by 1820, there were 6,000 of them. In 1818, just about the time when William King is retiring his debt to Bowdoin, he goes to his half-brother Rufus, who's in the United States Congress, and he seeks help to repeal the coasting law. The votes up until 1818 and early 1819 for Maine statehood were inhibited and resisted by Maine's business community because a lot of them used the ocean. And according to the coasting law that had been adopted by an early Congress, if you could not ship from one state to your neighbor, every time you crossed that neighbor's boundary, you paid, in essence, a tariff. So it made no economic sense for Maine shippers to separate from Massachusetts because they didn't really want to pay the coasting tax to New Hampshire or Rhode Island or Connecticut or New York, any of the states that abutted Massachusetts. So Rufus King goes in and he has the law repealed, which in essence takes away the resistance on the part of the commercial community in Maine, and they finally go along with the idea of statehood. A year later, William King, still irritated at Bowdoin, still convinced that there should be a second college in Maine, goes to the general court and asks that it grant townships, just like Bowdoin has. If you look on a map of Maine, you'll find land that has been dedicated to Bowdoin. It's in the maps. Nobody lives there. It's in the uncharted world of northern and western Maine, and it's part of the public land system. But they also wanted the $3,000 annual support, which today we might laugh at, but at the time was a sizable amount of money. When Massachusetts was having enough trouble paying its own bills, William King was asking for additional money. This is after the War of 1812, when Massachusetts again took it in the shorts a little bit. But the whole idea was to support the Maine Literary and Theological Seminary. Too bad, says the general court, they declined. Well, they declined because some of the other guys in Maine were against this idea. One college is all that's necessary. They don't want any college, whatever, that is to be in the way or a rival to Brunswick, Bowdoin College. That's delivered by Samuel Fessenden to the general court in March of 1819. If the Baptists want a college, I have no objections provided they can afford it. Never mind what Bowdoin could afford when they received help from Massachusetts. Oh, no. The Baptists can make it on their own or they won't have a college. So the whole thing was the resistance of particularly the Congregationalist community to the idea of a Maine Literary and Theological Seminary, which becomes, in fact, chartered in 1814. William King is trying to get it off the ground. It receives its first student in 1818. So when William King is asking for land and money from Massachusetts, they're looking at the Maine Literary and Theological Seminary and says, you got one student. Nice work. But the one student was a Baptist. And thereafter, as things go along, they will be part of the story. In July of 1819, all of this is happening very, very quickly. But in July of 1819, this is the vote total to separate from Massachusetts. And you can see that it's pretty significant in favor of separation. William King, as Maine is coming closer to realizing its ambition to be independent of Massachusetts, nevertheless carries with him a sizable, shall we say, vendetta. He wants Bowdoin to pay for making him pay for his brother-in-law's folly. So as he writes in the Constitution in Article 8, this is Maine's original Constitution. He wants the legislature of Maine to have the right to grant further powers to alter, limit, or restrain any of the powers vested in any such literary institution, meaning hello, Bowdoin. He doesn't mind putting that in there for the Maine Literary and Theological Seminary. It's barely started. But for the Bowdoin people, this was a shot across the bow. And they realized, William King is not happy with us. All right, let's roll the clock forward a little bit. We jump ahead, and in one of the other presentations where I'm going to try to walk how slavery was influencing everything that was going on, I'd like to get to the 1854, 1856 range. This was happening nationally. And I think it was, it may have been in the masthead, maybe it was the Bangor Daily today. where Israel Washburn, who goes on to become Maine's governor in the first year of the Civil War, Israel Washburn goes out to a rump caucus in the Midwest of the Democrat Republicans, and their schism there is whether they adhere to the capitalist idea that they need the institution of slavery, and therefore it's going to be business as usual, or they're going to hold that slavery is abhorrent and should be abolished. And this drove such a wedge between the politicians of what was intended to be the same political party that no, it in fact broke apart. And Israel Washburn returns to Maine. He's a 5-time congressman. He returns to Maine having given the name of the Republican Party. He took that separately and it passed among the rump caucus. So he comes back as a Republican. They convinced John Fremont, then in the Army, to run for the presidency in 1856. He doesn't make it. But by 1860, there are enough Republicans, when they have a national convention in Chicago, there's Abraham Lincoln. But when the Republican Party formally begins in Maine, this is at the same time that Biddeford and Saco split. Biddeford comes to stand on its own. Frederick Douglass, who's on his way to Portland and then I think to Bangor, comes by and he speaks in Biddeford. The road came through Biddeford. He stopped and he spoke. And he was talking to them about slavery and about the abolition of slavery. Well, one of the things that I went to Biddeford. I had a presentation there just off Green Street. And along the way, you find out that the managers and owners of the 3 textile mills in Biddeford, Saco, technically Saco at the time, but the owners of those textile mills lived on high ground, much as you would expect them to do because they could afford to. The high ground they lived on was Green Street. And they would go down and speak to the employees at the mill, and they would tell them that, look, you know, we need the natural resource to make the sheets, the curtains, the clothing, that we can put value added to that cotton. But without the cotton, we don't have jobs, we don't have a mill, you don't have money, I don't have a place to be. So they were arguing in favor of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which in effect upended the Maine-Missouri Compromise. But the odd thing was, there were 24 people, men in Biddeford, who left Biddeford and went all the way to Kansas in 1856 to vote against slavery extending into what had been the territory of Kansas. And I challenged the kids in the class. I said, you know, a lot of these people hadn't even been to Boston, and they throw everything they have away to go all the way to Kansas. There's no highway. If there's a railroad, good luck to you. But to go all the way to Kansas, someplace that could exist only in concept, to vote against slavery, touched upon what was going on in Maine at the time. Also going on in Maine at the time, Neil Dow was elected the mayor of Portland. Here he is in his general's uniform from the Civil War. But he came in with a very strong idea about what was happening in Portland. And for any of you who are in the Portland area, you know that Portland, according to TripAdvisor, is the #1 beer city in the United States. They've been rated that way. And all the craft brewers and everybody who are down there, giving Portland its identity back. Portland had an identity in 1855, 1856 through 1860. The rum capital of the United States of America, according to the import reports by the federal government, was Portland, Maine. They manufactured it, they imported it, they exported it. And of course, if you're down on the docks, chances are you imbibed it. Well, a lot of the guys who worked the docks were entry level, is what we'd call them today. And they were the unwashed, they were the unwanted, and by Neil Dow's definition, they were the Irish. And he had had enough of their behavior, and he had had enough of Portland being besmirched by these people whose daily rations of rum made them do things that he found to be antisocial. So one of his first acts as mayor is he gets up in high dudgeon, and he convinced the Portland City Council that they ought to pass an abstinence measure. that they are going to do away with the use of alcohol in the city. Well, they sort of thought, all right, fine, we got a social problem, we'll go along with it, I guess, fine, all right. Well, as luck would have it, Neil Dow was one of the few people who had the legal authority to sign for anything that occurred in Portland. And it turns out that many of the doctors in Portland would prescribe on occasion alcohol. So Neil Dow, in a moment of significant irony, has to sign an invoice and receive shipment of over $1,600 in alcohol. Well, word of that gets out, and Portland City Hall was close enough to the waterfront that some of these guys took exception to the idea that Neil Dow could stand there all high and mighty and tell them that they couldn't drink, but he, by God, had $1,600 worth of booze in his back office. So they start showing up and getting rowdier and rowdier as the afternoon went on, and they were getting off work. And finally, one guy decides that he's going to break in and he's going to get that booze. And as he goes to the door, Neil Dow, or Neil Dow's militia, fires on the guy and he dies. So the rum riot of Portland had one casualty. And it had a second casualty in a way because Neil Dow had national aspirations for political office. And he was going to take this abstinence movement nationwide as a politician. Turns out, no, he couldn't do that. He'd have to wait until after the Civil War to do it. But interestingly, this is the last time, the rum riot in 1856, 55, 56, is the last time that the militia in Maine are called up to do anything until the Civil War. Now, for those of you actually any of you, frankly, but for those of you in the greater Portland area, John Poor may be a name that registers. Portland Company was his development. He's the guy who was crazy enough to run a sleigh between Portland and Montreal to convince the shippers who wanted a rail route that it was faster to go from Portland to Montreal than it was to go from Boston to Montreal. And he proved it in a blizzard, practically froze himself to death. But he made it, and he made it in faster time than they could have done by going from Boston. So that helps explain why the oil line that runs from the tank farm in South Portland and Portland runs up to Montreal, or why the St. Lawrence Atlantic Railroad was constructed between Portland and Montreal. This was John Poor's contribution, first contributions to the city of Portland. His second contribution comes when Israel Washburn wants to have the weight of a committee behind him in writing to the federal government for additional support in preparation for civil war. He drafts John Poor, and he drafts Reuel Williams out of Augusta, and he drafts Hannibal Hamlin, technically out of Hamden, but most everybody recognized him from being out of Oxford County, but they also recognized him as being Vice President of the United States. Poor, Hamlin, and Reuel Williams formed the three men who had a committee responsibility to draft a letter for Israel Washburn to send to Abraham Lincoln. In it is the first testament to what we have come to know as the concept of Portland exceptionalism. And one of the lines that is definitely going back to John Poor is he speaks of the rail line that he helped make happen and how it connects to other rail lines, and the idea that the railroad had the capacity to move 10,000 troops between Portland and, say, Detroit any single day. Well, he was also speaking about the importance of defending Portland, and where they could talk about how many ships could come into Portland Harbor to escape the worst of the weather, or to perhaps be of a more nefarious bent and bring trouble to Portland. But this is where the President of the United States receives a letter from the governor of the state of Maine declaring the harbor is the finest on the Atlantic Ocean or in the world and can be easily fortified. Well now, That keeps going. When you look and say between 500 and 600 sail have been known to enter Portland Harbor for shelter, the first intimation of trouble with any leading foreign power would be the entrance of a hostile fleet. This was John Poor, and Reuel Williams had served in the United States Senate as Secretary of the Navy Committee. He signed on to this as well because he knew the importance of it. As Israel Washburn is sending this letter to Abraham Lincoln, Lincoln and his cabinet are looking across the pond. They want to know where France and England are going to come down, whether they're going to support the United States or whether they're going to take a look at the raw materials that they received from the southern states and perhaps align themselves with the Confederate cause. At the time that Washburn sends the letter, the French and English fleets are in Halifax Harbor. So Israel Washburn was looking east as well. He was looking down east to Nova Scotia, to what could be coming his way in a matter of days. And it alarmed the president and his Secretary of War so much that they immediately went to Congress and they secured a $100,000 appropriation to arm the forts on the coast of Maine. I should probably tell you that they authorized the money, but it was a rattling of saber. The cannons never made their way there. One of the things that I wanted to get to, and just as a tease, this is obviously a cartovisite, a CVD that is part of the collection of the Maine State Archives. There's another one coming up. Joshua Chamberlain, 32 years old, father of two, not married happily, but married in Brunswick. And on this day, July 14th, 1862, he writes to Israel Washburn and he volunteers. And as the professor of rhetoric at Bowdoin, you can see that he knows how to craft a sentence. He knows how to use lofty rhetoric, and he knows how to address a person of some responsibility. And if he believes it important to rescue the country from desolation and defend the national existence against treachery at home and jealousy abroad, well, by God, he volunteers. And he offers that he can bring 100 of his Bowdoin alumni and current students with him. The trouble was, Israel Washburn had no idea who this guy was. Not a clue. And even though Washburn had, as the Adjutant General, John Hodgson from Vesey, Hodgson's family and Chamberlain's family, even though Chamberlain's family was from Brewer, they'd never met. So when he went to Hodgson and says, do you know anything about this Chamberlain guy? Hodgson says, no, I don't. So Israel Washburn writes to the Attorney General. The Attorney General of the state of Maine is also the city solicitor of Portland. He's a former state senator and state representative out of Winslow by the name of Josiah Drummond. Drummond is also one of the founders of the Union Mutual Insurance Company. He's also one of the members of the original board of the Maine Central Railroad. You don't get bigger in the state of Maine and not leave the state of Maine than Josiah Drummond. His name is still on the law firm in Portland. He writes back from Portland to the governor of the state of Maine, and you can all do your George Costanza here because that's what he did. On the second page of a discreet letter to Washburn, Josiah Drummond asks whether Washburn has appointed Chamberlain colonel of the 20th. Drummond has gone out into the Portland community and found that his old classmates, etc., here say, you have been deceived, that Chamberlain is nothing at all. That's the universal expression of those who know him. The guy's nothing. July 21st, 1862. The letter is sitting downstairs at the Maine State Archives. It's a hoot. Very, very clean cursive writing, which is one of the other challenges. A lot of the stuff that we have to do, we have to transcribe into computer language so that people don't have to read cursive writing. But Josiah Drummond, bold-faced, that Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is nothing. Israel Washburn is in a kind of a quandary. He doesn't know what he's going to do. What do I do? So 2 weeks after that, he invites Chamberlain to come up to Augusta. Just say, hey, let's talk it over. And during the conversation, he offers Chamberlain the command of the 20th Maine. And Chamberlain responds with all due spirit that no, he's not going to take that. And in his humility, he says he doesn't know enough about military life, that he'd fail. And so he's not ready to do that, but he would volunteer. And Washburn realized that Adelbert Ames, who was a rising star in the Union Army, was about to be promoted. He said, if you go work under Adelbert Ames for a little while, you'll learn all the military maneuvers you need. So why don't you go with him and please say yes. So Chamberlain says yes. In September of 1862, he heads off to war. And by July of 1863, everybody knows who he is. Dorothea Dix out of Hamden, superintendent of the Union Army nurses. And Maine is the first state to allow women to serve as nurses in the Army. Trick to that was that, as you can see, these nurses were not going to be the centerfold for anything. Dresses had to be brown or black, no bows, no curls, no jewelry, no hoop skirts. Plain looking women. And one of the things that works particularly well with middle schoolers is you ask how many girls in the class would think of themselves as being plain looking. They don't leave for school every day looking in the mirror going, oh, I'm just so plain. They do what they can to make themselves presentable in their eyes. So I said, who does this? Well, try this. We have a letter in the archives from Cynthia Avram. I've been a nurse for over 15 years. I'm over 30. Cheerful temperament. Think as a nurse, I could do a great deal of good, and as well as receive some little compensation for my services. I cannot offer my services gratuitously, as some generous souls have done, because I'm too poor. I have no home and am dependent upon myself entirely for a living. I can procure certificates, if necessary, of my moral character and qualifications as a nurse. This entire presentation begins with the realization by Cynthia Avram, unmarried in her 30s, that she is plain. She qualifies. What tremendous humility that is, and what sense of service it is for her to write to the governor of the state, offering her services. You know, there are over 180,000 pieces of correspondence in the state archives. They're separated by military, some governmental, but in this case, this was a letter from Waterville. So we have folders from the individual communities. If you ask for them, or if you ask for the Civil War records, you'll be able to find them because they're retrievable. Just to give you a couple of numbers, remember we were talking about how many people lived in Maine at the time. This is the compilation of what happened to the people who actually went to war. These figures do not include those of the Navy. These are the federal figures, or excuse me, yeah, the Army figures for the militia who went from Maine, and then later the federal Army in 64 and 65. The disability, the dismissal by reason of illness, the number of guys who died of disease. You know, you look and say 3,200 died in battle, 5,600 died of disease, and disabled by disease or illness. The illnesses that these guys ran into, one of the lead lines that I presented to these classes is that the Civil War was the most transformative and disruptive event in Maine history. And you can see just by those numbers. Well, here's one that I thought, this always gets kind of a chuckle, at least from the teachers, when you look at what happens in the draft, as the instituted draft, because not enough guys were volunteering, they were running through too many bodies. And the real horrors of war were getting back to the communities. They said, well, you know, we're going to have to do something. We're going to have to force people to enter the military. Well, the number of people drafted in Maine, you can see that over the course of the war, 16,000. And you go down through how that turned out. And you get down to the number that were drafted and actually entered the service. All of the work that went into, you know, drafting 16,000 men, and the best you can come up with is 808 over the course of those 2 years. When you figure Maine had over 56,000 men serve in the Army, you're talking about less than 2% were ever drafted. Drop this figure in here just so people would know that this was an expensive war, more expensive than the Revolutionary War was to Massachusetts. But the number of families that were receiving aid, the number of family members, and the odd thing about this is when you get to the state budgets, and you can look them up, the state budgets of the 1920s and early 1930s still carried aid to wartime families from the Civil War. And it accounted for over 20% of the state's budget, which is a bit unique. The impact of the war, the fact that so many of these women continued to live, many of them would not remarry, and they lived well into the 20th century. Let's see. Am I with you now? We have a couple minutes left. Joe, I'd be delighted to answer any questions, help guide people. But that would you just give an idea of kind of roughly how some of these things came into being.
Dave, real quick, one question that showed up a handful of times where people want to know, is there going to be access to the PowerPoint that I can post online?
I have it in a PDF form, and I'm going to be sending it to you, yes.
Okay, perfect. Otherwise, you guys have the ability to unmute yourself. There was a handful of questions during the presentation. If you want to go ahead and ask Dave, now would be your time.
Yeah, paying for the substitute, I see that at 112. Neil Rold, Cindy, he was one of my early mentors. He was in the Curtis administration, and I think he was a candidate for Congress too, but he and I spent a lot of hours together. I have a number of his books. And I can tell you, Crystal, for the next one at 113, a lot of people had to change their names, and part of that also had to do with the people who were running the militia were, the vast number of them were Anglican. They were English, they were not French. And some of the Frenchmen would show up with French surnames, and they would be changed by the officer swearing them in, so that Jean-Louis became Jean Louis. And it was spelled differently, and it was pronounced differently, and he was given an Anglican name. And this happened over and over again. And it happened, there were 12 Penobscots who actually volunteered to serve. They too suffered the indignity of having their name changed so that it would conform to what the roster was supposed to look like. It is the same William King whose statue is on display at the US Capitol. There was some push a couple of years ago to maybe replace William King with someone else. King only served 1 year and barely made that before he went off to oversee a treaty between the United States and Spain that dropped $5 million into the United States coffers for distribution. And William King said, I can do that. And he went off to do the parceling out of the money. Yeah, there's a link to the slideshow. And Heather's giving you the digital Maine address, which I have in the next presentation, I believe. But there's a lot of stuff to go over, and I hope that you found some of this to be, if not useful, then at least interesting.
I can at least tell you, Dave, nobody left, so you've got that going for you.
Oh.
I think it was very, very interesting. Thank you so much for doing this. And I wanted to let you know I have like a family memory box that my aunt gave me. It's like in a big Tupperware with tons of old pictures and letters. And there's a letter from a relative that was in the Civil War. And I have old books that I found in my dad's attic, including one that was about Cumberland County. And um, my dad has old newspapers that are from like the 1860s that have beautiful drawings in them and stuff with Lincoln in it. And I keep telling the guy at my local historic society that I'm going to bring this stuff down, and I'd love to have it like scanned and whatnot. But what do you suggest I do with these kinds of things?
Well, it depends on how voluminous they are, but yeah, your historical society would be interested. Your local library would be interested as well, because it's, again, going back to the preface of this, the more local that I made the presentations to the classrooms, the more response there was to them, because they were recognizing their families in them. So the historical society is a good choice. There are for significant collections, and I'm not going to speak on behalf of our state archives staff now, but there were opportunities either through the state library or the state archives that this material could be digitized, and it would be available, especially if it had a broader value than that, and could be put up on Digital Maine, because there's a lot of harvesting going on of good stuff.
Yes, I'm also wondering, do you recommend using like a cotton gloves and things like that to touch those kinds of things?
Well, you'll be able to assess readily how fragile they are. A lot of it depends on the composition of the paper that was used, and particularly coming up before we get to where Maine becomes so dominant as a paper making state. A lot of the early paper was made out of cotton, and you can touch that. And certainly the vellum,
Okay.
any of the sheepskin stuff is fine. Just be very, very careful. If the idea of the cotton gloves, they've sort of gotten away from that, in part because a lot of the stuff has been digitized. The oils on the skin, in some cases, help the paper, but you're going to have to talk about a high number of people handling the paper before you're looking at endangering it with skin oils.
If I can put a little pop into that, I worked in the curatorial business for 25 years. If you have clean, washed hands, preferably something that doesn't have perfumes, it's actually safer for handling a lot of paper, because the cotton can sometimes catch on the edges of the paper and can cause tearing. You don't have as good of a grip on the paper. And also when you're storing it, just putting it between pieces of paper that, like Xerox paper, tends to be acid free. And that will help with mitigation of any acids that might be inside of the newsprint.
Okay, because I've been wanting to show my own children these old newspapers, but I'm kind of just nervous about, if they're brittle or handling them. But do you suggest that I put paper in between the pages?
That's more for storage purposes, but if you're going to be handling it, you can put it into plastic sleeves, and that will give it a lot of support.
Okay. All right. Thank you, guys.
Newsprint is a different animal, by the way. It will be brittle. And for a lot of the paper that is now being digitized and hydrated and flat form preservation, if you have a humidifier that you can breathe some water into this paper just so that it recovers some of its life. You have to wait for it to dry afterwards, and you have to make sure that you have it. In that case, you do want to sleeve it or put paper between it so that you can protect it. But the better the paper is, the more likely it is you're not going to have to worry about too much tearing.
Thank you.
Mr. Cheever, my question has to do just quickly about the Civil War. So we talk about it being a big event. Is there a specific time when certain parts of the Maine community began to kind of sympathize with the Confederacy. In Maine, it's not uncommon to see Confederate flags and whatnot. Never in large numbers, but they are there. And I was just wondering, at the time the Civil War was being fought, was there a very large and vocal contingent in favor of the Confederacy, or are the small pockets of favoritism now kind of something that developed later?
It depends on whether you're talking about Confederate support as a philosophy of government, or the capitalist support that said, if you want to secede, go ahead, just maintain your business connections. That's a different animal. There were people in Bowdoin College that Chamberlain could cite at the time who were in favor of secession. You know, if a state wanted to secede, and that was that whole question of whether this was going to be a republic or whether it was going to be a confederacy. And if it was going to be a republic, then that e pluribus unum phrase was supposed to hold. There were secessionist influences all the way through, and there were copperheads who were opposed to the war. There were some who were pacifists by nature, but there were others who viewed war as not being the vehicle by which this dispute could have been resolved. And war took such a toll out of the entire country. Lincoln himself wrestled with the idea of whether there were economic sanctions that could be brought so that the southern states would come around. And then he realized that probably not, because as long as the ports were able to operate and the raw material was able to reach whatever market it would be, England, France, Spain, Italy, Germany, as long as they were able to find outlets for their raw material, they weren't going to learn anything. And then Pierre Beauregard took care of that when he fires on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor in April of 61. And at that point, this becomes, in fact, something that is inevitable. Do you in fact rise up when somebody punches you in the mouth? And Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers. I got the proclamation behind me that we blew up, where Israel Washburn questions whether he has the authority to call up the number of men that Lincoln is going to ask for from the state of Maine. The militia of the respective northern states were the army. The governors determined what the militia would look like, and often would construct the regiments of these militia based on the needs. And this is one of the things that the draft was looking to get away from, was the concentration of so many young men from a certain area, such that if they had some sort of terrible battle, that you wouldn't wipe out the manhood of a community in one swoop. It was still in effect in Petersburg in 1864, when so many of the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery, which began as the 18th Volunteer Infantry Regiment, there's 862 guys who go across a 300-yard field in Petersburg on the 18th of June, and in 10 minutes, over 630 of them are lying on the ground, shot. And they're predominantly Penobscot River communities. There's a few from over in Eden, which is now Bar Harbor, but you come up and you go Castine, Orrington, Brewer, Bangor, Old Town. You go right on up through of these central Maine communities, and the impact upon those communities of that one 10-minute battle that they served in 1864. And after that charge, which was so catastrophic, George Gordon Meade said they would never again do a full frontal attack on an entrenched opponent in the Civil War, just on the sacrifice of the 1st Maine Heavy. And a lot of those guys they knew one another. That's what made the Dreams of the Wounded. So
Dave, I hate to do it. I have to cut you off. My science counterpart needs the screen. They're backloaded at 2 o'clock. So luckily we will have Dave back. Dave, thank you. If you could send me the presentation, I'll get all this loaded up, and save your questions for next time. We'll have David back in 2 weeks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.